Chapter 4. Networks of Cognitive Acts and Epistemic Communities. The nature of the interaction process as exchange and socialization. We must now turn to the consideration of the interactive process. For the purposes at hand, it is best to think of the prototype of interaction as reciprocal action. Two agents who are aware of each other and pursue their own, rarely identical, objectives, and who face each other in at least a partially shared situation. Each of the interacting agents is, of course, a conscious self. He does have a more or less stable and more or less elaborate conception of his own identity and of the situation in which he finds himself. He recognizes that the other participant also is a conscious self, thinks of himself in certain ways, and ascribes particular meanings to his situations. They communicate through shared symbols and ascribe to each other as well as themselves relatively unified perspectives, and above all, intention. Their views of the situation include each other and overlap at least in part. Nevertheless, the situation is typically asymmetrical, in that the actions of each agent are guided by different intentions and somewhat different values, and therefore by different perspectives upon the situation. Upon their first meeting, and continuing in the course of the interaction, our two agents size each other up. Each is trying to form, on the basis of whatever clues are presented to him, an accurate image, as accurate as possible, as he can of the other person, his background, his characteristics, and his likely intentions, which would include an assessment of how the others view him, whether or not the thought occurs explicitly. In these aspects of an acquaintance, each partner tries to figure out in what way the other might relate to his own plans and projects, and in what way he himself might be related to them. This does not have to be understood merely in the instrumental sense that people use each other. They often do. We may think of the relationships which may follow upon a first encounter of two agents as a series of exchanges. The agents each pursue somewhat different objectives, otherwise no exchange is possible. However, the pursuit of such different objectives will permit the participants either mutual gain for one person and loss for the other, or loss for both persons. If in the first stages, the objectives of the exchange are likely to be informational on both sides, the purpose of the exchange, and maybe its very terms, are likely to change rapidly as the action unfolds, and as, to mention only one variable among the very many that might enter into the process, one agent establishes significant power over the other. Each participant in the interaction situation acts on the basis of his hypothetical model of the other person, or, as Cooley puts it, on the basis of his image of the other. Zemel calls attention to this tendency to create, quote, types for the persons we deal with in an interaction. We thus orient ourselves to the other in terms of a type-like image of him. Such a type-like image will not only reflect the characteristics of the partner, but also features of the situational context, and it will be heavily influenced by the purposes and beliefs held by each agent. Especially important in this type-like image of the other is the agent's construction of the other's objectives. He will probably try to affect the other's objectives in some way in order to assure his own gain. Quote, try to manipulate the other's objectives, and will probably do so as long as he has objects under his control which the other person values. He thus exercises to some extent his power over the other person. By exercising power and affecting the partner's objectives, he changes his action tendencies, and this means that he changes the characteristics of the other. The other also changes under indirect consequences of the interaction situation. He learns more about his partner, his motivations may change. In short, agents cannot be realistically treated as entirely stable units over time. Their specific action characteristics and dispositions will change as the situation changes. Interaction, then, involves a dynamic relationship among at least two or more changing elements. Actors try to direct the actual course of the other person's activity to mesh with their own projects, and they must necessarily admit to some changes on their own part. Interaction is, in part, a process of constant socialization. It is difficult to overestimate the fluidity and the dynamic nature of interaction. The images of the partner, in terms of which an agent arranges his course of action, are very often built on subtle and sometimes easily misread cues. Since this process is of great strategic value to each participant, each tries to control the presentation of such cues to the other. He will try to present a more or less stylized image of himself in line with his objectives, his identity, and his situational context. As Goffman puts it, he presents himself by managing the impression he creates. Such attempts at stylized self-interpretation undoubtedly aid in stabilizing the process of interaction in that they try to link the presently visible front within each agent, or which each agent presents to his partner with the imputation of an underlying and continuing identity. The complexity of relationships among changing agents is further increased by the fact that each must refer almost constantly to a variety of yardsticks of symbolic placement and evaluation as the nature of the immediate transaction changes. The possibilities and varying interpretations of any single event are staggering, as we saw in the discussion above. Without counteracting trends, this would result in a breathtaking sequence of diverse social and personal images in the experience of interacting partners. The process is, however, stabilized by the attempt to maintain a continuing personal identity and the ascription of lasting characteristics to others and to limited activity systems such as roles, organizations, and collectivities in spite of real changes. Given the fact of change through interaction, which is inevitably at least a small change in the very attributes of the interacting persons, identity must almost constantly be reconstructed. All of us rewrite our personal histories after every major social experience. We check back, try to make sure that there is, after all, consistency and continuity. Where breaks in continuity occur, inconsistency must be admitted and the reasons have to be given. Personal histories, then, are often construed into periods and epochs, each with its own style, atmosphere, and contribution to the continued, embracing growth of our self-understanding. For collectivities such as nations or clubs, the same rules hold true and for the same reason. The writing of national histories, where it is not practiced for the sake of worldwide, disinterested scholarship, is usually nothing more nor less than the construction of national identities, including national characters, after the fact. If members of the collectivity are to define a major aspect of their own personal identity in collective terms, these attempts are of great social significance. Interaction, then, involves in one very important aspect the transformation of each partner through socialization and the stabilization of the process through the construction and presentation of identity. Every interactive experience which an individual may have must thus become incorporated into two different contexts of meaning, which are, as we saw in the discussion of interpretation, two different histories that intersect. One, the order of the group and the meaning which the experience has in terms of its structural context, and two, the order of personal identity and the significance and place the experience has in terms of the personal history. Every act may be interpreted and possibly legitimated in both of these two contexts, to the group and to the self. Symbolic stabilization of the interaction process defines a network of activity systems and identities which relate to the social activity systems and domains of meaning. The stabilized and symbolically fixed interaction patterns must be coordinated with each other in experiential time and space. Here lies one basis of social coordination. In the agent, there develops a specifically structured map of his social participations and their contexts, on which the significant activity systems and objects are placed in relation to each other and in relation to the self. Such a map has a distinct temporal and spatial base in that the coordination of social arrangements is closely linked with the organization of time and space through visible landmarks and shared measures of the interstices. The cognitive construction of others and of roles. The concrete point at which collective histories and personal identity intersect is that of the social role. Here we are dealing with relatively lasting and sometimes highly segmental, pre-established identities which are symbolically labeled in such a way that role-relevant situations, partners, and appropriate occupants are recognized as distinct. The image of the role develops into a cognitively coherent whole through the generalization of offered cues and by fitting it into the symbolically represented network of social coordination. Each role is culturally characterized, as Siegfried Friedrich Nadel showed, by a type construct which relates to the role to a culturally established system or network of roles. Nadel points out that role concepts are not inventions of the social scientists, but are used by the people under study. They refer to expectations of behavior and are logically both type and class concepts. They are usually more than mere class concepts, which label a category of objects. In that role concepts refer to behavior, to interactive settings, conformities of purposive action. We must add to this. The type construct of a role which is in actual social use may encompass the normative models of the role, but deviates often from them. A type construct describes central tendencies found in a category of things. It accounts by means of a unified scheme for some aspect of an empirical variation found within this category. Role concepts are types in the same sense. The socially used type construct of a role specifies what characteristics the occupant of such and such a role usually would have. Its normative aspect states what characteristics he may or should have, what orientations to the role-relevant situations he does or should develop, which appropriate theories and skills he should have or does have, and what the appropriate and the likely models of transactions among the role occupants and his partners are. Role constructs are thus symbolic stabilizations of inherently changing and sometimes fleeting interaction. They are anchored in networks of symbolically defined relationships with other roles. They identify and at the same time define the perspectives or orientations which the role occupant is likely to have towards his partners, and the orientations which his partners are likely to have towards him. In their cognitive significance, roles can be seen as the prime stabilizers of the orientational structure of society. They must be related to the encompassing conceptions of collective identities and must be compatible with the specific conceptions of personal identities held by their occupant. At the same time, social roles designate a series of timed and spaced activities. They specify, so to speak, a general schedule of social coordination. This schedule of activities is related to the orientational system of the role. The symbolic stabilization of this orientation is further anchored in relating it to a cultural context relevant to the role activities. This is especially obvious in the case of the professional roles. The implication is that the role provides role-typical perspectives, which consist of culturally available epistemologies, preference systems, theories, and methodology. Roles as orientation systems. Roles can be thought of as providing the central social arrangement of reality constructs, and their structure must thus be related to the structure of the frames of reference and theories held by the role occupant. Roles may, indeed, be viewed as frames of reference and theories in terms of which the role occupants deal with the situations which come their way. It may be an unconventional way of phrasing the matter, but it is nevertheless quite evident. Social roles and their orientation function provide epistemologies, basic categorical schemes, preference systems, and methodologies through which the role occupant organizes the encountered experiences and provides explanations for them. A mode of analysis usually reserved by the intellectual historian to the social role of the highly accomplished man of knowledge, such as philosophers or scientists, may by extension be applied to the roles enacted by the common folk. The guard in a zoo the administrator in a complex organization, the plumber, all possess more or less specialized frames of reference and explanatory theories which presumably equip them to do their jobs. Each designed for a work performance, such as the organizational blueprints decided upon by the administrator, or the plumber's plan for repairing a fixture, and the like. Each of these designs constitute the application of theories, not only in the explanatory, but even in the predictive sense. The users commit themselves heavily to the actual attainment of the desired outcome, which the theory implicitly or explicitly predicts. Role-specific frames of reference are anchored in the legitimation of the social role itself, but they also must permit the construction and application of workable theories. The theories built into social roles thus are influenced by two sets of constraints. Role-specific frames of reference are limited by the legitimation of the social role itself, but also by the actually encountered situations. The frame of reference of a role reflects the social location of the role in both the orientational and the situational sense. The social location of the role is fixed with reference to the institutional spheres and loyalty structures of a society. Quote, institutional sphere are sets of interrelated values and corresponding social activities which cluster around socially recognized tasks. Institutional spheres often are more or less formally organized. This is particularly true in the public domain. The extent of formal organization, however, is a matter of wide variation. Examples of institutional spheres include the business sphere, the political administrative sphere, the religious sphere, the military sphere, the educational sphere, and other domains. The organization of an institutional sphere can be characterized in terms of its specific value system, which provides the most general rationale for action within it. It further involves the actually operative social relationships, which, together with the values institutionalized within the sphere, determine its dynamics. The concept, quote, institutional dynamics, end quote, may be a useful term to refer to the social changes which result from the specialization and clarification of the value purposes of an institutional sphere. Within institutional spheres, social action is guided by the frames of reference and epistemologies which are broadly set by the values and by the more or less specific theories which deal with the demands of situational tasks. Each institutional sphere, then, can be treated as a subsystem of society, providing its own impetus for change or stability, the direction of which may be in conflict with the impetus for change resulting from other spheres within the same society. The specific social location of a role within an institutional sphere can be plotted on something like a map of the differentiation within and among institutional spheres generally. In order to understand the location of a role, the interrelation among institutional domains must be clarified, especially with regard to the strategic positions which may give one or more domains dominance over the other. In their internal structure, the specific relationship among the roles within the sphere is also significant, particularly necessary to understand the special value system underlying the institutional sphere, and their relations to the values of other domains. The special value system within a sphere describes in a most general sense the system of action orientations found in this domain of society. More specifically, it also determines a legitimate way of evaluating propositions, their rank and their differential authority. Each institutional sphere, then, has to some extent its own legitimate distribution of authority and rank, which provides one structure for the stratification of roles. A given role-specific frame of reference usually will also relate to the groupings into which the role occupant is generally integrated. Here the concern is with a person's loyalties and memberships. Loyalty is simply the socially positive side of personal identity, and group loyalties provide the structured distribution and the organization of such social identity. Institutional spheres, naturally, may give rise to certain role identifications and loyalties, but rarely do they become the central focus of felt and expressed loyalty. There are groupings which often cut across different institutional spheres, providing one form of integration of the society. The action orientation constitutive of loyalties to groups is comprised of personal commitments and emotional identifications. It is not, as the institutional spheres, primarily focused on the exigencies of dealing with cultural objects and work situations. A given social role, however, will tend to be defined in terms of both institutional and loyalty commitments. One must attempt to find the roots of its specific frame of reference in both aspects of social relations. The discussion has shown that there is a strong relationship between the frame of reference of a social role and the values of institutional spheres and social groupings into which it is placed. The tendency of these structural units of a society to drift in the direction of comprehensive and isolative values, respectively, is strong. The demands of solving socially recognized tasks in the institutional spheres make for an emphasis on comprehensive values, which is quite different from the drift towards isolative values in bounded groups, which results from the experience of social boundaries on one side and of belonging on the other. These tendencies provide strong determinants of the variation in the role-specific frames of reference and in the substantive theories which are acceptable. They also make for affinities among social roles. The activities and the orientations of role occupants do relate to those of other systems, between roles as orientation systems and roles as social objects. In this interplay, actual transactions are accomplished, each where the relationship between the orientation of one role occupant and that of the other is one of disparity. It is true, there must be a shared base of understanding the situation for the interaction to proceed at all, but the actual degree of similarity in the frames of reference with which the role occupants approach the situation is a matter of wide variation. There are several possibilities. The first one is the complete identity, or a high degree of similarity in the orientation systems. Fellow believers in a common faith, persons with the same occupation and training, may be illustrations of this category. Most actual transactions in society involve some dissimilarities of orientation, but the cases of identity of orientation systems are especially interesting from the point of view of the social distribution of reality constructs. Where we find such similarity of frames of reference, of epistemologies, we find naturally also agreement on the application of similar reality tests. In the case of organized social arrangements which maintain such similar epistemologies, we may speak of, quote, epistemic communities, such as that of science, of organized religion, an ideological following, and the like. A second possibility in the relations of orientation systems is that of a very high degree of dissimilarity, ranging from the case of total and systematic misunderstanding to the case of highly segmental and regularized relations. Total misunderstanding, the systematic misreading of the other's view of the situation, is probably more frequent in social life than is generally assumed. Political life offers many illustrations of this phenomenon, but we find it in other domains too. The difficulties with which many psychiatrists appear to encounter in the psychotherapeutic treatment of lower-class persons may be used as another example. Where frames of reference are disparate, but transactions are of necessity frequent, as in the case of many laymen's relations to some expert, a supporting framework of social arrangements tends to arise which limits and structures the interaction context. Misunderstandings continue to occur, but the limitations in the scope of interaction and the distribution of power within it channel them so that their consequences remain socially acceptable. A third possibility is that of the case in which one of the interaction partners understands the other without the reverse being true. The orientation systems of the first agent can be said to encompass that of the other, whereas the other misconstrues the orientation system of the first agent. In these cases, great manipulative power falls in the hands of the knowledgeable person. The establishment of epistemic community. The meshing of highly similar role orientations is essential for the establishment of epistemic communities. We are dealing here with those at least partially interlinked roles, which are unified by a common epistemology and frame of reference, such as the scientific community, religious communities, work communities, some ideological movements, and the like. All members of such a community in their capacity as members agree on the proper perspective for the construction of reality. In these communities, the conditions of reliability and validity of reality constructs are known and the applicable standards are shared. Within such epistemic communities, we may thus speak of truly shared modes of the construction of reality. Rarely is such sharing established on a society-wide basis. In fact, in the differentiated society of the industrial age, it is especially obvious that any individual is likely to participate in various ways in different epistemic communities to which he is linked by his roles and through channels of communication. The diversity in his own modes of reality construction is then directly linked to the scope of diversity of epistemic communities. The establishment of the shared frames of reference characteristic of epistemic communities is a delicate process. There is not only the requirement of value congruency among the participants, but moreover the need for power arrangements in the exchanges of the interaction processes which sustain the shared perspective once it is established, or influence its acceptance in the first place. We did see that power is an integral part of all interaction. The significance of power relationships in the growth and maintenance of epistemic communities is illustrated by the high level of power consciousness which can be observed, even though it is sometimes disguised, in nearly all professional groups, and certainly in the most ideological movements. The sociology of epistemic communities must in large measure be concerned with the frames of reference and epistemologies themselves, but it deals with such facts in the context of the organization of interaction patterns, including the power structures sustaining them. Epistemic communities, once established as power structures, tend to regulate not only the frames of reference or orientations of their members, but they also concern themselves with the regulation of the allocation of situations to the member. The assignment of tasks on the basis of certified experience is merely the most clear-cut example. The relationships within the surrounding society are a matter of grave importance to such communities. The careful management of information flow out of the epistemic community can often be understood in the context of power structures and attempts at controlling the situations which members must face. One aid in the process is the tendency to standardize the symbolic system used within the community in such a way that it becomes separate and distinct. In many instances, the barriers which flow naturally from such separateness are reinforced by conscious attempts to keep certain knowledge secret, hidden from the views of the ordinary man. Whatever the specific constellation of these factors may be, which we might find in a particular epistemic community, there are certain quite general principles which hold true across the general diversity of epistemic communities. The importance of the interplay between the structure of the frame of reference, the symbolic system used within, and the power arrangements of the epistemic community are among them. The consequences of differentiation in socially organized modes of reality construction for the role of common man are another general field. There are relatively few different ways in which the common man can be linked to the variety of epistemic communities in his society. From the epistemological point of view, the critical difference among epistemic communities lies in the nature of the experiential base on which their reality constructs rest, and in the principles of equivalence or non-equivalence of observers within the relevant domain. The experiential base of the reality construct was described in the previous chapter in the typology. The pragmatic tests of experienced workability, the logical test of deductive establishment of truth, the mystical test of personal insight, and the test by authority or alienation. It is evident that in the case of the first two types of reality test, observers are, in principle, interchangeable. In the case of the latter two instances, this interchangeability usually does not exist. Observer equivalence is, of course, the prevailing principle in science and the science-related work communities. It is qualified, to be sure, in that the observer must establish his proper credentials as a person holding the required frame of reference and using the prescribed symbolic system. But in principle, these and other prerequisites are believed to be learnable, so that all men, given proper preparation, are seen as qualified. One competent observer is as principle as another observer. In fact, the scientific enterprise is built on the requirement of intersubjective verification of observation. Experiences which are in principle only accessible to one person are outside of the proper domain of science. This does not negate the fact that one man, who happens to observe a natural phenomenon which no other has seen before him, may be a qualified observer, and his observation may be properly within the domains of science, if it is not in principle private. It is clear that the internal structure of epistemic communities, which are built upon the principle of observer equivalence, must necessarily be different from the internal structure of those epistemic communities which are built upon the principle of non-equivalence, or the belief that in some especially privileged observers. The religious prophet, or the inspired charismatic leader of an ideological movement, are believed to have superior powers of insight. They may be viewed as having access to sources of knowledge inaccessible to others. The superior power of vision in the man of higher qualities is widely believed in certain types of epistemic communities, and it becomes itself an aspect of their mode of reality construction. Broadly, the principles of observer equivalence or non-equivalence relate to the work and logic-based reality tests on one side, and the identity and authority-based reality tests on the other. We found the social organization of work and of authority to be the matter of the greatest importance for the understanding of reality constructs. It appears that working communities will tend towards the application of work-related reality tests in the context of observer equivalence, whereas ideological communities will tend in the opposite direction. These are issues which we will explore in detail in the last part of this